Now let's hear viewpoints from both sides of the aisle. We welcome Austin Barber and Brandon Jones to our MPB studios. Austin is a Republican strategist and founder of the Clearwater Group. Brandon is an attorney and a former Democratic member of the Mississippi House. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the State of the State address with Governor Tate Reeves. He talked a good bit about record economic growth. Austin, do you think he described it accurately?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's easy to describe accurately when it's true. So if you look at the major projects that the governor has announced, obviously we're most familiar with AWS right here in Madison County,
Amazon.
close to Amazon. Thank you for where we are right now. The largest project in the history of Mississippi from an investment standpoint. Then he follows it up with another, and it's a data center, big, huge investment, huge infrastructure, capital investment. Then he followed that up here recently with another project in Meridian that's going to be another data center. These are huge deals for Mississippi. Great news for Mississippi that we've got companies of this magnitude and technology intellect that's looking at Mississippi, and not just looking, but picking Mississippi over a lot of our neighbors who I'm sure are competing for it too. So yeah, I mean, you can brag and you can do it when it's accurate and true.
To the extent that these decisions are made at the government level, that the legislature votes on economic packages, they're almost always bipartisan. In fact, I can't think of one that's not. And when Democrats had control of the legislature, Republicans voted for them, and now vice versa. I think where maybe there's a disconnect, Austin, is when you talk about economic growth, we can evaluate these companies on an individual basis. They might be doing great things. Some of them might not be performing up to what they said. But where is it showing up in the bottom line for the state? Because when we talk about economic growth, knowing that some company out of California is making money doesn't warm the hearts of someone who's living in a small town in Mississippi. What they want to know is, where is that revenue showing up in the Mississippi economy stream? And so knowing that this year we're $81 million behind on revenue, that's where I think there's a disconnect. It's like, you can tell us about this investment and you can tell us about a good company, but if we're not seeing that in our bottom line, if we're struggling to fund infrastructure projects, if we're not putting as much money into schools as some people think we should, then that's where I think people say, well, we hear you, but why aren't we seeing it in the basics?
Yeah, a slight pivot on what you just said is, I agree. It's not just that a company from California or Canada is making a bunch of money. It is, how is it impacting our Mississippians' everyday lives? And I look, and when you look at AWS and you look at a number of the jobs and big projects that we've landed, what kind of jobs are these? What's the salary that he's going to pay? And what it looks like, these are going to be big time salaries for Mississippi. These aren't minimum wage jobs. I mean, these are high 5 figures, low 6 figure type jobs, and that's what's most important for me, is that Mississippians can improve their way of life because of the type of job that's landed in Mississippi.
Austin, you mentioned those data centers like AWS. We know that they consume a ton of power.
Yeah.
And the governor, it seems like each State of the State address of his, he mentioned something that maybe people weren't expecting. And I think this strong emphasis on energy policy was that for this State of the State address. Is that what he was talking about when he was talking about the need to invest in our energy infrastructure?
Yeah, no
to support
question.
Industries like that?
Yeah, no question, Wilson. I heard Governor Barber say a long time ago, Brandon was in the legislature and maybe heard the same thing, say, we in Mississippi are blessed with natural resources. We need to be able to use those natural resources to the benefit of our job recruiting, goals and aspirations. It's changed a little bit because of the types of jobs that are in such demand now. We've talked about these 2 data centers, and sort of in layman's terms, which is sort of where I always live, those are massive power users. Okay, for Entergy or Mississippi Power or TVA, whoever it is, it has to supply them power. It's not, if the governor calls and Haley Fisackerly, who's the head of Entergy, and goes, hey, guess what? We've got this new AWS. It's $10 billion investment. Haley Fisackerly is like, oh my gosh, how are we going to be able to create enough energy so that they can run their operation? So as an Entergy or Mississippi Power or TVA, they have to go figure out, how do we do that? If Mississippi can become a state that can offer an abundant amount of power for these types of projects, we will be at the top of everybody's list to want to bring these types of projects, which is why you have to think about diversifying. How do we grow nuclear? How do we get ourselves in a position to where we can be at the top of the list, not just because of our economic and regulatory environment, but because we can give you the power that's needed, Brandon, for your next big data center or whatever that project is.
Yeah, I mean, there are parts of the speech that were kind of like a pharmaceutical commercial, where it shows you like a beautiful mountain plain, but you don't really know what they're selling. That's the problem with some of the things that you say, hey, exploring energy possibilities is good. More energy, good. As a listener, I'm like, sounds great, but I'm not sure what we're talking about. So I think with some of this, and look, that's just a function of speech giving. Sure. The governor knows more than I do about what's about to happen economically in the state, right? He knows what companies are considering investment. And so sometimes you're listening to these speeches and you're like, well, who could be against any of that? But I don't know what he's talking about. Yeah. So there was a lot of that in this one. And look, y'all, we can't get past talking about the governor's state of the state without saying, from an optics standpoint, there were about 4 people there. It was probably his least charged delivery I've seen in all of the speeches he's given. So it was kind of just from a listener's perspective, you kind of had to hang in there. It was like eating your vegetables to stick in there with this speech. And so I just wanted to mention some of this stuff. I listened to it and then I read the text. It wasn't the most, I guess, Austin, my critique would be clear. There was a lot of, it was a tough follow.
I've never known the governor to mix words or not have a very transparent message. So I will disagree with you on that. Listen, I think Tate Reeves has done a really good job as governor. I think when he is done, people are going to look back and go, that is the guy who transformed how competitive Mississippi is in sort of this big time development recruiting world where we're competing against Texas and California and Tennessee and so forth. And he's going to get A+ on that. And I think he's going to get A+ even from his time as lieutenant governor on where we are with education. But I mean, he's never been sort of this dynamic speaker. You can't be everything. Phil Bryant was a guy who was a great retail politician. Haley Barbour was viewed as the guy who was there after Katrina when we most needed someone like him. And so I think that Tate Reeves' legacy, he's got more years, but his legacy is going to be, he's the guy that got us ready by thinking about how can we make sure in 5 years and in 10 years, we are the #1 power producing state in America. That's important, and I'm glad he's thinking like that.
Yeah, we have limited time, so no comment. Let's move along, Austin.
Brandon, he talked about House Bill 1, the tax bill, and he came out in support of it, even though it includes tax swaps, as they call them, because they're raising tax on some things and in an effort to cut the income tax and the grocery tax. Is this a change from his previous position, and what do you make of it?
It is, but I'll say this may surprise you, Wilson. I'm not critical of him for changing opinions on that. That's what good people do, good leaders do. You can change your mind about whether or not you support a policy or not. What I would criticize him for is just banging the drum on the need for a tax cut when it doesn't represent sound fiscal policy for the state of Mississippi, whatever the form it comes in. I mean, we get over 1/3 of our budget from income taxes. There's been no suggestion that any of the things in this bill would help us to replace that amount, even by their own admission. The people carrying water on this have to admit it's not going to cover the whole thing. Both of Tate Reeves' predecessors had to make mid-year budget cuts, which means the budget is performing so poorly, we have to change off of what we just predicted months ago to make additional cuts. The reason for that is Mississippi's left to its own devices has a hard time meeting its obligations. The reason that Tate Reeves' term has looked different is because we have had a glut of federal money coming into the state, unprecedented amount of federal money coming into the state, primarily from a Democratic administration. That money is not going to be replicated. That's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And what Republicans are doing are making 20, 30, 50-year tax policy based on one-time money that will not be replaced. And so the problem that I have with Tate Reeves embracing this, and the problem that I have with House Republicans trying to shove it down our throat, is that it represents bad fiscal policy. Again, we are $81 million behind this year in terms of tax revenue. We're talking about cutting an additional $1 billion moving forward. Where do we get that money? Where do we replace it? And we already know we're not meeting our obligation, even under these circumstances, with the increase in funding to infrastructure, to schools, to hospitals. We're doing better. I mean, in some of these areas, I have been complimentary of this group, but we're not doing as well as we could do. And now we're talking about undercutting what we've, historically used to pay for these things.
Is it too much, Austin?
Listen, I think that there's just a difference in philosophy here. And House Bill 1, I believe, was passed, correct me if I'm wrong here, with bipartisan support. I think there were Dems in the House.
There's some Democrats that voted
I don't know
for
if it was 10. For some reason, the number 9 is in my head, but there was Democrat support of House Bill 1. But look, debating tax code, debating tax reform, it's a good thing. And I'm glad that Chairman Trey Lamar has forced this issue. I shouldn't say forced; that's a strong word. He has ensured that this conversation has started, and the House moved on it fast. Chairman Lamar did a good job, and we're going to see what Chairman Josh Harkins in the Senate and the Lieutenant Governor how they'll react to this. I mean, Tate Reeves has been not bashful at all. His whole political career, where he stands on taxes. He against them,
Yeah.
and he wants to reform them, and he wants to lower them, and he believes that we're in the right place to do this. You talk about infrastructure, rightfully so. Infrastructure should be, one of our number one goals that we're trying to make sure we fully fund. Part of this bill would raise by 5% the gas tax. Those dollars would go annually to MDOT. I think it's at a $400 to $500 million year per year. I think that's the number where it is of where those funds would go to MDOT so that they could put those into projects every year. And of course, this is a 10-year plan, so it's not all going to hit in 1 year.
Those Democrats who voted for it, I just want to be clear. I know I'm here supposed to be representing the left. They made a mistake, and if I were still a whip, I would still be in their ear about it. There's no reason they should have voted for that. One of the things that we believe as progressives, as Democrats, is we don't believe that regressive tax policy is the answer. We don't think that you should shift economic burden to the people who can afford it the least. And the truth is, for most Mississippians, House Bill 1 is a tax increase. If you're increasing the price of buying goods or increasing the price at the pump, you're increasing taxes for most Mississippians. And the people who bear the brunt of that are people who have to have those things in order to subsist, whereas people with a lot of money who can afford to pay taxes are getting a big cut.
10 seconds. And I don't want to argue about how this tax reform bill will impact every Mississippian. But I did have a conversation with someone at the Capitol the other day who was not a legislator, not a staffer, a really smart person who had run all these formulas and at a whole bunch of different levels for retirees, for people who were making less than $100,000 a year combined household income. He felt like it was going to be a win for the vast majority of people.
Hey, if it passes in a few years, let's get back together and talk about how it went, which we no doubt will do. The governor calls Medicaid expansion a form of welfare. He has repeatedly called it welfare in his speech that would hurt job creation and economic development. Others argue the opposite. Austin, what do you think?
Well, I think that Medicaid is a safety net program that plays a vital role in providing health care to those individuals who fall into that category. And I appreciate Drew Snyder's leadership at the Division of Medicaid and how he valued every single dollar that was there and tried to make sure that those who were eligible Medicaid recipients tried to get the best quality of care they possibly could. Are there problems with Medicaid? Absolutely. Are there reasons to try to address those, to fix them? Absolutely. But that's that way throughout government. And so, look, the legislature is going to, I'm sure, debate this issue again. The House and the Senate last year had differing opinions. My last thing I'd say is I think we need to see where the Trump administration is going to be. Drew Snyder, who I just mentioned, looks like he's going to have a very big role at CMS, running the division of Medicaid for the whole country. We will have friends and allies there who can help us see this is how we view this. So if the legislature decides to make this decision or that decision regarding some type of expansion program, this is how this could impact you guys financially in year 1 and year 10.
Brandon?
I think this is where the governor's legacy is going to be, Austin, in turning down the best deal available to states in the United States, maybe that's ever been on offer. I mean, we turn down billions of dollars a year each year that would build out infrastructure, that would provide health insurance coverage to over 200,000 Mississippians, that would prevent them from using our emergency rooms as their doctor's offices. It's a moral issue. It's an ethical issue. You can't be pro-life and be anti-healthcare. I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. You can't be, I'm for unborn babies, but I don't care about grown-ups who are sick or who need help. And we lead the league in virtually every indicator when it comes to basic health and quality of life and longevity. And part of that is directed at our failure to do the most basic, moral, economically sound thing that states are doing across the country, and that's expand Medicaid. And so I don't even know that Governor Reeves believes any of the stuff he says. This is when he's at his least persuasive. I think he's playing to an audience of one, as unfortunately too many Republicans are. I think he thinks this is a type of rhetoric that appeals to Donald Trump and his acolytes. I don't think it works for Mississippi. I think it's been a huge failure that's cost lives and that's frankly held us back. I mean, when you want to talk about attracting people to come and put business here, that was a big point of his speech. Don't you think those people want good working hospitals when they bring their families here, when they ask people to come and work for them? If you don't get health care right, you're just not getting it right as a place to live. And I think Tate and his policies have failed us there.
Tate Reeves has believed this before Donald Trump ever ran for president. I'll just say that.
Let's talk about education. The governor talked a little bit about test scores, and he what would you say he implied about accountability measurements and switching from growth to overall scores?
Well, look, I just want to say I am proud of this legislature and the governor for signing these, incremental pay increases for teachers. I appreciate the effort that's been placed in funding public schools. Of course, some of us who are advocates for public schools would like to see more, but I do appreciate increases when they happen, and you can't sit here and, be critical of something like that. I think there have been some very important gains in recent years. I've always been concerned that lurking in the shadows was an effort to privatize some of this stuff, Wilson. I've always been nervous that we were going to get to the point that we were not adequately acknowledging that in some places, for socioeconomic and other reasons, it's hard to go from D to C. It's hard to bring somebody up to a certain level. And when that happens, we should celebrate that. That should be a positive thing.
Yeah, I agree.
It shouldn't just be about rich school districts and they kind of hold all the cards. And so, out of concern for those kids who are in places that, we want to see the system grow. I want to see continued investment in public schools. So anytime that there's conversation about we might evaluate differently or we might move things around, I would hate to see people who desperately need those resources not have them available to them in the name of, rewarding high scores or so. I don't know. So there's a little bit of concern there when we start talking about, kind of pulling the rug out from under our public school system.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I missed that part of the speech, just to be fully transparent with everybody out there. But what I do know is that, and I appreciate my friend over here saying that we have seen great advances in funding of public schools and teacher pay and teacher scores. And yes, Republicans have led on it, but a lot of Democrats have stood right beside them and worked hard with them in committee, outside the session, having conversations, listening to teachers, educators, business people, community leaders. How do we best do this? And yeah, the poorer, more rural school districts are sometimes those that are struggling the most. noticed and they do need attention. So I'm just glad that we've got another session where we're debating more education reform and how do we continue to tinker with this to try to get as best as we possibly can, Wilson.
Austin Barber, Brandon Jones, thank you for another informative discussion. This has been At Issue, a weekly discussion about the 2025 Mississippi legislative session. You can hear At Issue every Friday night at 6:30 during the session on MPB Think Radio. You can also subscribe to our At Issue podcast, which features extended versions of our roundtable discussions and featured interviews. And if you'd really like to see what we all look like, you can catch the video versions of our roundtable and interviews at mpbonline.org and on YouTube. At Issue is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting. I'm Wilson Stribling. For all of us at MPB, thanks for joining us.